Flint, it's good to see you. It's been a couple of months since we've, or maybe longer. It's been a while since you've been on. Anyway, yeah, and you're muted in case you wanted to say
Just
hi.
want to say hello. I'm going to try to do this off video by cellular connection because it's a Saturday and I'm not working.
That is such an
So,
old-fashioned concept. When you're working in agriculture, there's no weekends. Coffee doesn't stop.
no doubt.
No,
Well,
thanks.
yeah.
Thanks for saying hi.
Great to hear your voices and I'll listen in and enjoy the conversation. Thanks.
Bye. Um, so I will again, if nobody has any like burning questions or not even burning questions, it could just be something that you want to chat about. I know Paolo usually has something that he wants to chat about, but I do have some things that have been on my mind about. Nick and I are going to SEA in Houston in April, and I'm trying to like work on harvest and then also have an idea of what I want that presentation to be. Instead of, I mean, it's been a long time since we were at SEA. It's been 2019 was the last one. So yeah, 2025 is going to be quite a return. So I don't know if I need something like completely new. I'm finding so many people still don't have like a confidence in microbiology, a confidence in what's happening in fermentation. So I don't want to stray too much. But one of the themes that I'm thinking about is how much our climate is changing and how difficult it is to continue to process coffee the same way with our same kind of protocols and our same tools when things are just unpredictable. So, one example is how much rain we've gotten this year in Guatemala when it's completely unexpected. And we're not, at least in this farm, we were not ready for that to happen. We were not ready for intermittent rain because the drying method is patios. So the idea of investing in a mechanical dryer is very daunting. The power that it needs for 8 containers, this type of the volume that this facility does, but I think it's something that needs to be considered. So that's one avenue of what topics to discuss. So again, processing coffee in a changing climate. Um, but Nick really likes the idea of expanding the definition of climate to just the culture, our changing climate of buying practices, our changing climate of consumer trends, the political climate, different coffee prices. So there's a lot tends to expand in that like changing climate. Like we're being asked to make coffee in this like completely unstable future. And it's a very traditional, very slow, process. Agriculture takes a long time to grow new varieties. It takes a long time to dry your coffee and be able to cup it and then have some feedback and then be able to like change something about your harvest. I think that's one of the challenges that I'm facing right now is that I've mentioned that in Guatemala, we started a little bit later because of the cooler season. So we, instead of starting, in early December, it was like late December. January has been full on, but it looks like it's not going to go long. It's not like the harvest just kind of like moved over where we're starting later and ending later. It just is compressed. We're starting later and it seems like we're ending earlier as well. So that compressed window gives even less opportunity to try things in a certain season and then have some results, have some feedback, and then change something. Then you have to wait a whole other harvest. You have to wait a whole other year to work on some of the changes or kind of updates that you want to make. So right now, um, one of the things that I want is I'm trying to do more drying trials so that I can bring you guys some information on the protocol that we've talked about that Flavio Borem recommends, which is like an interrupted drying, where instead of kind of drying your coffee until 10 and a half, 11%, and then you have a rest to like stabilize the coffee and then the coffee improve like the traditional riposo that we have in most Latin countries. He recommends doing that like rest in not in the middle. It's more like around 15%. So it's very close to the end so that your coffee is free mostly from water and you don't have a mold um, risk and it's much more stable. But you're getting that rest right in that moment when you can, take advantage of it in the patio. So I'm doing some trials, which means that I'm extending my drying even longer in my compressed window. So I have even less time for that feedback so that I can do something else. Um, so I'm having uh, a little bit of anxiety. I'm like, hurry up and dry, except the whole point is slowing down drying. So, anyway, that's just me. I see, Dylan, you just turned on your video. Is there something you want to share with the group?
Yeah, yeah, just to your point about like at the end of drying, having like a resting stage. I've seen it quite. I haven't been to Kenya for some years, but probably about 12 years ago when I was there, they would have these near the drying racks, they would have these big cages where they would store the coffee. It was under a covered area, but still relatively open to the environment, and they would have almost like chicken wire, and they were basically like these big open bins where the coffee was stored after drying, but prior to bagging, going off to the mill. So I'm not too sure if they still do it, but I think it's something to maybe I think it's similar to what you're saying. And then I mean, I think we did speak about it the last time, but definitely the shift towards mechanical drying, not necessarily the traditional Pinalanzi big rotary dryers with high temperatures, but similar processes, but using technology to better control the processes. Because watching, I've been processing coffee for over 20 years, and watching you guys doing your drying, I have the utmost not sympathy, but I feel your pain, put it
Yeah,
that way.
there's a lot of
Watching you
pain.
drying in the sun like that,
Yeah.
it's painstaking, not the but more the frustration of being able to control it. You
Mm-hmm.
know, you've got to you're trying to have an outcome of a controlled processing, and you have these variables that are swinging so massively. So just I feel your pain.
Thank you, Dylan. I'm curious how you're drying in South Africa.
And hey, Lucia, could I just interrupt with a quick question?
Oh, sure, Flint.
I know it's in the podcast, but what do Professor Moretti do you hope to achieve again by the late slower phase? Is it greater shelf life or what is it supposed to achieve?
Yeah, so why would we even do this interruption? Thank you, Flint. That's a great point to remind the group. So the goal is stability, and stability of meaning in terms of the water activity and being able to dry coffee well. Because when we dry coffee too quickly, what can happen very frequently is that the water kind of, there's water throughout the entire seed. And if we dry too quickly, we're just kind of drying the outside and forming a crust and trapping water, more in the interior. And that water is available to then migrate and kind of bring the humidity up, or it's able to, react to with different, it's able to chemically react and change our coffee, or it's able to be available for biological life. So in either situation, like any kind of change that results in like fading or in just like off flavors, like water is a really great catalyst for those reactions. So if we can reduce our water significantly and the water activity, then we can have a longer shelf life. However, what Borem is proposing is that having a pause in the middle of drying, or not in the middle, sorry, towards the end of drying, having a pause at that 14% moisture content allows the seed to have some metabolic processes that can actually improve coffee. So he's seeing higher cup scores with a different drying protocol. So it's both about stability, and that's how I've approached it. But then he's also positing that it has improved quality, and we're not just like, trying to make our coffee last longer, but we're trying to both make it last longer and taste better. So that's why we're trying to do this interruption. And he he's done it with his coffees. I haven't tasted those coffees, and I just thought we would try it. Also, on this group, we've had some feedback from Lowell in Honduras that that's kind of that they've like backed into the system. It wasn't on purpose. They weren't trying to create this, interrupted drying, but they found that when they were collecting coffee from their neighbors at a higher moisture content, and then they would finish off that drying, that it helped their quality as well. So again, I've had like anecdotal, you know, comments that this is helpful. So I wanted to try it myself. And anyway, back to you, Dylan. I was asking you about your drying.
Yes, so we used to dry on shade cloth and plastic sheeting on the ground, and then wrap them up at night.
Mm.
Then move to the tray drying system, often seen in very old videos, including if you ever watch the movie Out of Africa,
Mm-hmm.
you'll see those trays used in the movie. So, but the trays we initially worked with were made out of wood and very heavy to carry. So what I worked with, what I found in and sourced was a plastic tray that was used in the fruit drying industry, which is stackable. So we dry on these plastic trays, which initially we were using outside in the sun, but after measuring temperature and humidity, and even in winter when the temperature is supposed to be quite low, reaching temperatures out in the sun at over 40 degrees Celsius. So I then moved them into the shade and did some similar tests, but ultimately have now working with where we stack the trays and then push air through the trays, which with air conditioned air.
Mm.
Um, and so that's pretty much how we're drying now.
And how long does that take? What's your kind of drying rate?
So the speed of drying is, as you know, is probably more important than the time it takes. So I mean, we have done experimentation of processing coffee within 24 hours, so from fruit to cup in 24 hours, just to see if it's possible and what is the outcome. But we're looking at a 5 to 7 day cycle on drying. We're still working with recipes on drying, and we don't have the necessary technology currently to be able to vary the recipe. We're looking to change that. So uh, yeah, it's around 5 to 7 days currently.
Okay, and those 24-hour trials, did you try those kind of over time to come back in 4 months and 6 months and see how they were doing?
No, so the 24 hours was everything from pulping, fermentation, washing, drying, roasting, the whole
Wow.
thing. So it was more of a test of, can you produce coffee at that speed? Is the cup quality warranted? And it still tastes like coffee.
Mm-hmm.
And I've only done it once, um, so it's possible, but it was just an experiment to see if that was possible. Um, but there we did time it that overnight. We had the drying, so we basically used the night for the drying, and though we achieved quite low, we still had high moisture content. So it's another project that I did a number of years ago where we were roasting at higher moisture contents. So from that experiment of roasting at high moisture contents, we roasted the coffee at high moisture content.
And higher something like 13, 14, or like high, like 20?
Like so I mean, the project way back then, I don't have the date in front of me, but it was probably, we had a number of different points of moisture content from 16 up to about 24. So
Wow.
at 16, I think we did 16, 18, 20, 22, 24.
Okay. That's an interesting
Yeah.
concept of how quickly could we process. I like, 7 days to me. I would love to get down to 7 days. Right now, our average is 15. Yeah. And last year, we could do 10. So this year, with just much more moisture, these kind of rain episodes, and I don't know if it's just like cooler nighttime temps. I didn't take as good notes last year as to how cool we were getting. But we are drying at 15 days. And then if you see kind of the rest of the patios that don't have on, if you don't know what I'm talking about, on my
Shame.
Instagram stories, I share how we're drying on our patio, and I show our coffee has shade cloth, and then the rest of the patios, there's like three different levels that don't. They're taking even longer. So they're at like 18 days. So it's interesting that with shade, we're actually drying a little bit more quickly. I think it also has to do with we're also mixing more than they are on the other patios, but it's just something to share. Um, okay.
And just a question, Lucia, have you are you measuring temperature and humidity on the drying on the patios?
Yeah, we have a little, like room humidity meter down there. So we're doing kind of the ambient humidity and temperature under the shade, as well as the surface temperature with the gun. And then every now and then I'll take my thermometer and kind of do like a bean pile, which can be, lower than the surface temperature as well. So we're looking at all those. Yeah, we're looking at temperature like four ways.
And the humidity that you're measuring in on the patio, what is it? What is it kind of range?
So
What is
in
the range?
midday, when it's the hottest, we can be very low. We'll be at like 20 to 30%. And then in the evenings, once the sun goes down and it gets cool, we'll shoot up to like 60, 70, 80 in a day. So we'll be from 20 to 80 in a single day. Yeah.
Okay. I think if you do watch that and log that, that's the driver. That humidity, obviously temperature plays a factor, but it's humidity that's the driver um of um of the drying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like I said, being able to get that low humidity at like 20, I was thinking that would help us a little bit more, but it's not enough to counteract how humid we are, I think, overnight, at least in these like bigger, like just masses. If you guys have seen the stories, we're doing 1,500 kilos of coffee like at a time. There's these big masses, so I think they also just hold a lot more moisture when they're together, and it takes longer. I think it's just a slower um like a slower transfer when you have that much mass, but not a physicist. So anyway, where were we? Okay, I see we have a question in the chat. And oh, Lowell, you popped in your video. You want to say hi?
Eh, Do that question in the chat first. That's a good question.
Okay.
I have something to say about that too, but
Okay, so this
that's,
question
I'll pause.
is from Alejandro in Colombia, and he was just in Guatemala with us. He's a newer producer. And the question is, I have one follow-up question after FTC. As you know, my bottleneck at the moment is drying. I'm looking to redesigning my flow. I'm thinking on alternatives on how it can hold coffee cherries before depulping. How can I hold it for 2 to 3 days without creating high damage? For example, how long would they hold their quality by submerging them in water? Or have you tried any other alternatives? One idea on why to do this is to create some sort of buffer time before entering the flow. That way I could have the 6 day, around approximately 6 day average for drying. Yeah, Lowell, if you have a update on that, I'll shoot it over to you.
Well, we've done some of these experiments in Santa Elena. Mostly we did it because we try and get 2 or 3 days of cherry picking into one lot, because a lot of times the amount of cherry is maybe 600 or 700 pounds for a small farmer. And so if they could depulp 2,000 pounds instead of 3 days of depulping, so you're finding ways to hold that coffee for a couple of days without it um, doing something you don't want it to do. The problem with holding it in water is it will stain the parchment. So if you hold it in water for 24 hours and then depulp it, you'll get like a reddish hue on the parchment. I don't remember if that does anything to the coffee seed, but you'll get so the farmers didn't like doing that. My suggestion would be to hold it dry in an airtight environment. And what I've seen a lot of folks in Colombia doing is holding it in like grain pro bags in a shaded area. And I think if you're going to do that, the other protocol you might use is um, washing the coffee
Do you
You
mean
might wash the
floating?
coffee, floating it, and so you know how some of the people are doing sanitizing it. I probably float it, sanitize it, put it in a sealed bag for the 3 to 4 days, then depulp it and do it dry. I wouldn't hold it in water because it'll probably stain the parchment.
But why sealed bags? Like, do you want that pressure, or is it just so that they don't fall out? Oh, flies, yeah.
I, for me it's risk management
Mm-hmm.
because because it's the same thing with floating and washing. Just because you can reduce whatever microbial activity is happening, because he's not doing it necessarily to macerate the cherry, and even if he is doing it to macerate the cherry, he doesn't want inconsistency.
Yep.
So it's like the lower the microbial activity on that cherry while you're holding it, so that you can catch up, is what I'm assuming he's doing it for, to help his workflow. You want to manage risk, and to me, if it's in a sealed bag, you're really reducing the microbial activity to a lot, right?
Yeah. No, I agree. So Alejandro, again, this advice is it could be opposite. So like this is a lever that you can pull, and I completely agree with Lowell that this is a huge kind of opportunity for inconsistency, but it's also a huge opportunity to have an impact on the cherry. So people that want really funky coffees, that are trying to get like extreme flavors, are doing this method, that are purposely holding the cherry for 3 days before pulping, before moving forward. And so that's where you can get these extreme kind of, so we can go one way with saving the cherry for 3 days and go more extreme and more kind of funky, crazy flavors. But again, that's inconsistent. So if we hold the cherry for 3 days to be able to kind of batch and have kind of more breathing room on the drying end, and then also what Lowell is saying is to be able to more efficiently process more coffee on one day instead of like trickling in 3 or 4 days and getting all the equipment dirty and kind of splitting your team. So the way to make this kind of be a holding place that it doesn't have a lot of impact is sanitizing your cherry, which is not something that I usually, it's not something I do because I'm inoculating, but it's definitely a tool that you can use. So we've talked about sanitizing your cherry with hydrogen peroxide, with maybe some like low percentage alcohol. What else could you use to sanitize your cherries? Does anyone else? Lo, what?
Didn't you haven't people on the patron talked about using ozone?
Yeah.
I don't do this. I would just use water. I would just wash it and float it because, but
Yes, washing and
I don't
floating.
even know what ozone is.
Washing and floating definitely reduces your microbial load. So that would be different than sanitizing. So reducing your microbial load, I would put it kind of in one category. And then if you want to go the next step to sanitize by adding, uh, something to further reduce the microbial load, I think that would really help. And then ozone is uh, like usually you need electricity. The machines create electricity so that oxygen is two oxygens together, and ozone is a third one. So it like makes the three of them come together. And so when you apply ozonated water to a surface, it's really unstable. So it is very antimicrobial because it's like bursting whatever cells are there. So ozone is amazing because it's basically just water, but it's like charged water. So an ozone machine can be pretty pricey, but I've used them for cleaning, and that's my if I had a choice, if I had unlimited money, that's what I would do, is use ozone. Um, and then, okay, sorry, Alejandro has another follow-up question. He says, if I sanitize the cherries, would have a high impact on the inoculation process. So if you sanitize the cherries and you want to inoculate with a commercial yeast or some other culture, that would be better because sanitizing the cherry is reducing the microbial load. So if you're adding something on top, it's like less competition. So it would be great to have those two combined. Sanitizing and inoculation are a good combination to work on. But if you're sanitizing your cherry and maybe you're not inoculating, then it could maybe take you a little bit longer to start your fermentation if you've like reduced it so low and they're so clean and you're not adding anything else. Um, it really would depend on your environment and kind of like the cleanliness of everything else, like how your tanks are washed, how your equipment's washed, maybe kind of your workers kind of moving back and forth. So that one's really hard to answer. It could go both ways. It could make it really easy, or it could be, more challenging. But Lowell, I think maybe you had something else to say that wasn't about Alejandro.
I just wanted to encourage Nick to continue down the the path of climate being more than weather patterns. And I would suggest that he look at permaculture because I took classes years ago, but one of the things I liked about it is that in permaculture, some of the courses deal with the politics and the economics of all of the decision making that you're doing. So you might be starting with the soil, but you think about just mechanical drying, for example. Um, what you're going to do is when you start to have to mechanize in order to offset the risk um, of weather, this is going to change the type of coffee producer versus farmer. Because if you think about it, a farmer who has 2 or 3 manzanas or 2 or 3 hectares of land, they can pick their coffee, depulp their coffee, ferment it, and do all those things. But imagine if they had to start dealing with like demuselizers and mechanical dryers. And so what's going to happen is if we have to become more and more mechanical to offset the weather risk, all of these folks are going to have to start delivering their cherry to a middleman who's a processor. And this is going to change the culture of coffee. Um, and it's going to make those farmers who are small more and more exploited. And eventually they're just going to quit. And then people are going to come in and buy up all the land. And, Honduras, a lot of people own land, but Guatemala is a country where almost nobody gets to own land and it's all big farms. And so you're going to change the culture in places. And so these are all that's what I think if he focuses on that culture, I think I could spend hours talking about that.
Well, no,
And then the other point I wanted to make is um, I mean, the other thing is the in the Discord, the Paolo versus and Epstein back and forth dialogue on geisha and how soil has changed.
mm-hmm.
Also, we focus so much on processing to offset some of these climate risks, but how much of the soil and farm management is the reason we have good coffee, and can you really offset it with processing techniques? And so I think that's another goes back into that culture of coffee, right?
No,
Like always, I'm always saying too much.
not at all. Well, we're always happy to have you. I completely agree, and I think that maybe one of the things that is I'm not doing a good enough job of kind of communicating and processing. Like, I love processing. That's what I'm focused on. But most of what I want, like my minimal approach to processing and also the reduced fermentation time, is to say, don't spend 100 hours on processing. Let's do it in 12 and then have that extra time or bandwidth or like mental space to spend on the farm if you can. Because I think that that's where you can have way more leverage. And so I definitely do think that some people are thinking that you can like process your way out of bad agriculture. And I don't believe that. I don't believe that there's a processing that's good enough or strong enough or innovative enough to like cover up, malnourished fruit or, plants that are struggling or just a bad fit, a bad genetic fit in a certain climate. I think more sophisticated cuppers can kind of taste through that. And I think that's where we got maybe some of this idea of processing is like covering up or processing is like makeup, trying to like dress something up. And I think that maybe newer cuppers, newer buyers, new people to specialty can be distracted by processing at the beginning. But I think eventually you have enough experience, your palate is sophisticated enough that I feel like I'm at that place where I can taste a coffee and it can have all of these, strong flavors, but underneath, like, I feel like the fruit tastes tired. I feel like there's a lot of effort or a lot of like strain. I'm like, this coffee's working really hard and it doesn't necessarily need to. So I think that one of the downsides of getting really into fermentation and processing is that we've left agriculture kind of, I don't know, we're just, again, distracted. It's not that I don't think it's important. I just think they've forgotten that that is more important than processing. I just happen to not be, I don't know enough about agriculture to have any feedback on that. Um, but Lowell, the thing I wanted to say about
And
the other topic of climate, and like, I totally agree. I think that's more important to talk about, like the changing political climate, the changing like economical climate, like like what does the new producer look like? I just don't know what to say about that in like a 45-minute presentation at SEA. Like, I don't know what I have to offer about that because my training is microbiology. Like, I'm not an economist, to be able to like give people some hope or some like direction. Like, it's a super interesting discussion. And I think maybe it's more podcast episode or like more like crowdsourcing like your guys' feedback and ideas. But in terms of like an SEA presentation, like that's what I told Nick. I'm like, I don't know how to like give people any update on, or not update, but like any direction on what to do in that area. Like, I can tell you what to do in your tank, but I don't know what to do with like coffee prices. Victor says,
I
since
think
when
I
do we
think
need
one thing you
expertise
do
to tell
is,
people what to do? Victor, I'm not a white man. I can't handle that. Sorry, go ahead, Lowell.
no, I'm a white man. That's why I probably have a terrible amount of ego and opinion. One place I agree with you. I think you should stick to the biology because that's what um, you are expert at. But I think there's always the question, what are the unintended consequences
Yeah.
of advice, right? And so, I mean, you learn that in political science when you're a kid. Um, but like, for example, one place I would look at coffees, I pay a lot of attention to the to coffees because Myra works for Royal, and I read a lot of the descriptions of coffees coming in from different places. And like one example is Indonesia, and you'd have wet hauling Indonesians, and I think it was a product of the logistics of Indonesia and a lot of small producers or a lot of small farms and the coffee being produced or processed at the farms. And now you've got investors coming in, multinationals, and now you're seeing washed coffees, and you're seeing I saw 100 or I saw 14-day fermentation. I'm like, that can't be right. But they were doing it in airtight tanks, and so okay, maybe now you're getting more diversity of processing from Indonesia, but who's doing it, and at what cost to the farmer? Because to me, it's like if I were a lot of money, I'd go to Indonesia, buy buy cherries from brown people for cheap, leave them in poverty, and then process their coffee in special ways and sell them to customers and maintain the chain of poverty. And I just that's depressing to me. But that's you see it a lot in places like um, Tanzania as well, where you have Newman with wet processing stations. And so to me, this is the culture of coffee because it could be that with the way the weather is going, that people can't process their coffee on their own terms without a lot of risk, and that these guys are actually coming in and doing a great service by allowing farmers to still make money off of their coffee. But I kind of doubt it. I'm kind of cynical about that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the structure lends itself really well to that kind of abuse or that kind of, using, being able to buy cherries cheaply, because that's what we've done with coffee is put so much emphasis on like the post process. Like, if we can just, like I mentioned, fermenting your way out of kind of bad agricultural practices, or if you just get like the fanciest roaster, or if you brew it in this particular way. Like we've put so much emphasis on that part of the chain, saying like we don't really need to worry too much about what you buy if you further down do these other things. So it lends itself well to buying cherries as cheaply as possible. So I like the reaction to that, where we want to care more about what's going on the farm, and that's getting a lot of attention, but I still don't feel like we're doing it right. As many of you know how I feel about terroir, and I think that terroir was like an attempt to rectify this, but again, we're just like using this tool to further alienate a lot of producers and the way that we talk about it. So I don't feel like we've quite found that like sweet spot of being able to appreciate the raw material and be able to understand where quality is coming from. I think it's like really diluted and spread out into all of these things, because I guess coffee is a really complicated product compared to wine, where you can open a bottle and it is as intended by the producer, the person who made this thing. You don't have to you don't have to roast it and grind it and brew it at this water temperature and serve it. Like, that part is taken care of. So it feels much more, I think, accessible to people to just open a bottle. Anyway, Micah, did you have something you wanted to share about your comment?
Yeah, I want to ask. It's related to climate, drying, and fermentation. So the 80% of our product is wet hull coffee. So they are really fragile when it comes to drying. So if we are drying faster than we used to, it becomes really hay-like, earthy notes to it. But if it's longer than we have to, it becomes really fermenty. So because of the climate change, becomes really windy in my area. So if it's become windy, it's slower the drying it takes. So it may be related to the fermentation in the coffee that I've been drying. So maybe the topics will be cool if you can talk about it. But yeah,
So remind everybody where your area is.
I'm from Indonesia. It's in West Java, Bogor.
Okay. And you're saying you wet hull after how long? How long do you let the coffee begin to dry a little bit and then wet hull it and then you finish drying, right?
So I dried in the parchment for around 3 days, 1 to 3 days. Then I hull it so it becomes wet hull, and I dry it for like 7 days till it becomes a 12% green bean.
And I'm just curious, do you wet hull because that is like your protocol? That's just like the advice that everybody is given, or are you trying to make wet hulled coffee? Or would people not accept conventionally dried coffee?
It's because the demand on the local market, they really love wet hull, and the wet hull is really what I should say a comfort taste for people in
Mm-hmm.
Indonesia. So they really love it. So yeah, I make them because the local market love it. So that's why I make.
Yeah. No, I love the way that you put that. It's a comfort. It's a comfort like flavor. It's a comfort profile that people are used to. So I think that you're right to like link these two things together, because we think of fermentation as the thing that happens in the tank and then drying is later. But when you learn a little bit more about the microbiology and kind of what's going on, and you stop thinking about fermentation as only happening in a tank and think about it more as microbial activity, as long as you have moisture, you have an opportunity to have microbial activity. So, the early stages of the early stages of drying are really a continuation of the fermentation, because there's still a lot of moisture and there's still microbes available to react, to have a metabolism. So getting the coffee dry from water in that early stage kind of helps like slow that down, so that it's not as active a fermentation in when you're drying as when you're like actually in a fermentation tank or a bag or whatever other vessel. So you're in the unique position where because you're wet hulling, you're removing the parchment, and the parchment, as we've talked about kind of in traditional drying, is like a protective layer. And that's why when I'm sharing my Instagram stories, was focusing a lot on not breaking that parchment, on making sure that parchment was completely intact, because I want to protect my seed and I want to have that longevity. And if my parchment is cracked, then I'm open to oxidation. I'm open to microbes getting in. It's something that we generally try to avoid. But in your part of the world, because it does produce a certain flavor, you're doing that on purpose. So you're actually removing this protective layer and continuing to dry. So you have, like, the value of that is that removing that layer allows you to dry to the end, because in really humid environments like in Indonesia, it's so difficult to dry coffee if you don't do this. So I think wet hulling came from a necessity. Like, we just needed to do something. If we take that layer out, we can get drying easier. So you've both made your job easier because you've removed that barrier to drying, but you've made yourself vulnerable to even more microbial activity. And so, like you said, you have more of that fermentier, like you have an opportunity for defects more easily than somebody who's not wet hulling their coffee. So you have this like Goldilocks window where you don't want to go too slow because you are open to having just your coffee change. You don't have the control and you're vulnerable, but you don't want to go too fast because then you could be, again, you don't have that protective barrier, so you could be damaging your seed. So you have to play. So this is all kind of just to give, people some background as to like why Indonesia does this and some of the challenges that you have. But can you ask me your question again, kind of like now having that context, what is it that you're wondering about? Like, when are you fermenting?
Um, I think it's related to the pair method that people not really talking about. It's airflow and how it works to the drying stages. So, yeah, as you say that water activity is related to moisture, and because of it's become windy because of the climate change, the drying has become flavor on it, which is something that we don't really like. I think that's a topic that maybe you can talk about in the STA.
So, okay, sorry. Were you saying, it cut out for a second on my internet? Were you saying that because of the increased wind and more airflow with drying coffee, is that making your coffee better? Is that improving drying or not?
Not
Okay.
because we're doing wet hulling, it tends to be fermenting because it's slow drying. We tend to not using slow drying in wet hull coffee, especially when they already hulled.
Mm-hmm. Well, so that's interesting because what I remember from Borem's teaching is that naturals, with all of their protective layers, they have the parchment and then they have the cascara, the dark skin, they are more temperature sensitive. So if you have really high temperatures and like sun shining directly on them, they are more likely to get damaged. They're less resistant than a washed or a parchment dried coffee. But parchment dried coffees are more susceptible or more easily damaged by really high airflow. So now you have wet hulled coffee, which is more the extreme of that parchment. You have even fewer layers that are protecting it, and airflow. I could see, using his logic, that airflow would not be conducive to better quality coffee, and that's what you're finding.
Yeah, that's what I found when I reviewed my harvest season
Uh-huh.
in the past.
So
Yeah, I hope it's not really windy this season. I just hope that it's really hard to control the drying when it's become windy, especially when I dry in the open area. So
yeah, I was wondering if you could have, wind blocks or, having something to kind of cut down that force. I know that in El Salvador, they have, they plant trees, but trees in the coffee farm to create like curtains and barriers because they have such strong winds. So something, because yeah, our the plan of hoping is not a really great plan. That's what we're doing too. I'm hoping it doesn't rain. You're hoping it's not windy. Someone else is hoping it's not too hot. It's a grim production plan. But I saw that Paolo, you turned your camera on. Paolo, did you have a comment? Yeah.
I want to ask you two questions.
Uh-huh.
The first, drying phase. Have you ever used or is someone that use the new full control dryer that use in competition coffee? And the question is this: you say before the drying phase is the continuation of fermentation and so on. Is correct. But um, what is the perfect way to use, or if someone use this full control dryer? How can use this tool in a maximum way to give the maximum quality? What is a no, confused question. The second is I never have answer about the uh, life of the tree coffee, because no one talk about this. Because I know in Colombia they use the soca every 7, 8, 10 days, 10 year and so on. But what is the maximum life of coffee tree? I know that the question is Bermuda's interview with about Panama. No, he say that they have a plant that reach 20 here, so there is a down of quality, and so it's really complex. There is some question to answer at this my two question. Stop.
Well,
Sorry for it for English.
Paolo, I don't have any insight into anything competition coffee related or that drying system, but I will contribute. And so if somebody else does, you can let us know if you've uh, used
It's
one of
a
these
full
dryers or
control of
familiar.
dryer. This is the question. They have a full control of dryer or
Yeah.
dry phase. How they use? Wow, I don't. They don't talk about. I know the temperature. You have not to reach the famous 40, 45 degree because you kill the germ and so on. But I don't know how much time they use. What is the phase? Because I saw here that they give you the when you buy coffee they give you the curve of the drying phase. This is a really interesting.
That is super interesting. And that's definitely something that I'm moving towards is having having a drying curve like we have roasting curves, because we know that
Yes,
the coffee is susceptible to different um, is susceptible to damage, and it has different concerns at different times. And the water that is available, the free water in the beginning, comes off really easily. And then as you continue drying, that water is more and more tightly bound. So you need to apply a different amount of energy to that water to release it so that it comes off. So it absolutely makes sense that we should be thinking about drying as a curve and applying different amounts of energy and heat at different times, because the seed has different requirements. So if you can have, I would love to see that. I haven't seen anybody share their drying curve. I can share
because
my drying.
here Carlos Campos Logas Bean, when they talk about the
Mm,
competition process, they say they give you the fermentation curve and drying curve. They give you when you pay only
Lojas.
500
Okay, so
euro
that's
for one.
Colombia. So that
This Colombia.
the leaders, the leaders in innovation.
No, they are the song of Bermudez. This is the
Mm,
new
the connection.
generation.
Um,
Mm. And so
for
for
the
the tree life,
tree, yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
anyone that, sorry.
There's not enough conversation about the age of trees, because I think that um, one thing I like to remind people, same with yeast, when we talk about like, why can't I just keep the same kind of yeast culture and use the same yeast over and over again? It's because living things get old. Living things have a certain life cycle, and you definitely need to, refresh them. So that's why I use, because I want consistency, I use the commercial yeast and I make a fresh batch for a new coffee. I'm not recycling that yeast because then it would change and kind of drift. So when it comes to trees, I do like to remind people that there is a primary metabolism and a secondary metabolism. So or a function. So like the primary function of the tree, like it'll grow and it'll have leaves and it can be alive for 100 years. But the life cycle of the secondary metabolism of producing good fruit, that is much more limited. So the idea of like when is that sweet spot, I think it must have to do really strongly with the variety. I don't think we can say that all coffee trees should be replanted at 25 years or something like that. I think there should be a really significant range. Um, but I also think that there may, and I don't know if this is true for coffee, but I think some of the thinking is borrowed from wine and wine grapes becoming more concentrated, and that the older vines are coveted for their quality, but the trade-off is that you have really decreased production. So if your criteria is the best flavor, maybe you want a 60-year-old vine Zinfandel or a 100-year vine Zinfandel, but it can produce so little wine that it's pretty useless, and so people regenerate. So I think, Paolo, just being a little bit more specific and saying like, when does it produce the best coffee? What is the criteria for the best coffee? Is it
No, in Colombia they used to after to have a soak after 8 10 years. No, they have a circle.
yeah? Oh, as
The
low as
four
seven.
side
Seven
of the
years, cut it
plantation.
back.
Yes, sorry. They have four. The three one have a production. The four they cut. They have the famous soca. No, this is regeneration of the crop. But they talking about 8 years, 10 years. But normally in the other country they don't use this. For example, in Ethiopia they never cut. They have the native tree, and so this is completely different. But for example, in Guatemala, you have plant of many years.
We here have between 15 and I would say 20. They're not that old. Do you have any?
No, but they also do the
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 pruning.
pruning here every
Yeah.
couple of years. So they'll do like 1/3 of the
Pruning,
lots.
you make pruning,
Yeah.
deep pruning, and after year you have a decrease in the quality of coffee. Or,
Dylan,
yes,
you have a comment?
natural.
Yes, on our farm we have over 35-year-old trees. So the problem comes but in a plantation, most of them have died. So the actual percentage from the original plantation is much more decreased. So we've started a new planting program because we've always followed a retuning or a pruning regime, but it's an old Kenyan, Tanzanian method. I've been up to Tanzania where I've seen 60, 70-year-old trees that are still cultivated. So the actual stump itself is very old. It almost looks like an old tree trunk with every year of cutting back, but you still have like 3 brand new or 4 brand new stems from that stump.
And you
The
said 60
question
or
is
70?
Yeah.
70.
And yeah, it's undetermined. They think it was planted in like the 1940s or 50s.
Wow.
But you have the change in the quality of coffee. This is the question because the question born in the Panama. Someone say that Panama is decreasing the super high quality because the plant became old. For example, in apple, we see this in apple in apple cultivation. You see some variety decrease after 10 years and so on, decrease the quality of the apple. I connect with the coffee. It's probably the Panama tree too old, not old. Someone is old, and they are decreasing the quality. It's changing. So it's time to cut. When is time to cut? To replace the plant? This is the question.
When is the time to replace the plant? Well, Jack Ray just put in the comments that maximum production is on 4-year-old wood. So if your criteria is
Yes,
that maximum, that, when is the time to
this is
replace,
correct.
that's the Colombian
No, no,
method.
I find the paper on Cafetero del Colombia. There is a paper talking about the maximum quality, the curve of the quality in the coffee. I think yes, it's correct. For 70 years, that for 4 to 7 years is the maximum quality. Yes, Cafetero Colombia.
So, I
So
mean, I don't drink that much coffee from Panama. Oh, geez.
no,
You guys.
I know.
Thanks. Um,
No,
and
no, it's not the drink. No, it's not about Panama. It's about
about trees.
the change of the quality of the coffee in the time. This is the question.
Does anybody
I
else want
think.
to share their insights on how old their vines are when you make that decision? I guess I'll just, as we're wrapping up, Dylan, throw it to you. You said you have 35-year-old trees. When are you going to decide to? Are you just waiting for the production to really be low? I know you've already started planting.
Yeah, so I think we made the decision way too late.
Too late.
So I think we should have started replanting many years ago. So our new decision is actually, and again, we will decide in the years to come, because our oldest plantings now, our youngest plantings are probably 1 year old, but 3 years old from that original replanting.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll probably do heavy pruning in year 7. And then I think on year 15 is when we will replant on like a second heavy pruning. That's kind of the thinking at the moment from our experience. Many years ago, we didn't have very good, strong data, so we can't tell exactly. We know better now in terms of yield per hectare, per plant, per block, and we could make better decisions ongoing. But it's also the susceptibility of disease. As the plants grow older, the older stumps, the older cuttings become more susceptible to disease. So it's not only the productivity, but it's also the mortality increases as they age.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks for sharing. Thanks everybody for coming. Sorry I have to cut this off. It's 10 and we have some other appointments. So thank you. As always, just because this discussion is over doesn't mean you can't continue it on the chats or some of the other channels. I know
They can stay here if they want.
you guys, yeah, you guys can stay here. I just have to go and we're going to stop recording. But you can always hang out with each other. And yeah, thanks everybody for joining. And I will see you in a week or two.